Sorry. I'll go with these. Why is my phone to rotate? And I didn't want to do it. Right. Apologies. I wasn't able to print my script, so I'm trying to read off my phone today. So today I'm going to be talking about the Powell-Cotton Museum's Reimagining the Museum program, and in particular a project that I've been working on, which is called Colonial Critters. So Reimagining the Museum is a program of works that encompasses a variety of projects across the museum, which collectively aim to address the colonial histories of our collections using the museum's vast archive as a resource to interrogate stories that the museum has told in the past and enable us to tell different stories that are more inclusive and more honest. And this work doesn't necessarily mean completely changing our displays. In some areas, the museum redisplay is happening, but for example, our natural history displays mainly consist of massive dioramas that are the size of large rooms. We can't change these, we wouldn't want to. So in this case, reinterpretation rather than redisplay is the approach that we're taking. And, you know, Reimagining the Museum as a program is fundamentally about a conceptual shift in how we understand and communicate our collections. So that should all work out fine. So the aims of the project, the Colonial Critters project is just one of the projects that sits kind of under the umbrella of Reimagining the Museum as a program. And the aims of this project are, I guess it's still ongoing, to research the history of our natural history displays, to catalogue our taxidermy specimens to make their records better, make more information more available, and to run an engagement program to get people involved in the project and to build relationships with communities of stakeholders, both locally and globally. We initially applied to the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund for this project in 2019, but we were unsuccessful. Thankfully, our board of trustees agreed that the project was vital to the development of the museum and agreed to fund it internally. We officially began work on the Colonial Critters project in September 2020 and aimed to finish in the spring of 2023. That hasn't come. I'll explain why later. So, as a bit of background, the museum began its life in the late 1890s as a venue to display the animals and objects that were collected across the African and Asian continents by the museum's founder, the big game hunter and collector Percy Powell-Cotton. And after Percy's death in 1940, his son Christopher held the directorship for over 60 years, although his mother Hannah actually ran it until I think the 1960s, while Christopher was in colonial service in Uganda. And Christopher's stated purpose for the museum was for it to be a fitting memorial to Major Powell-Cotton, his wife and family. And that really is what the museum has been for the last 18 years or so, a memorial, with key displays kept pretty much as they were during Percy's lifetime, and celebratory narratives throughout the museum that gloss over the difficult colonial histories of our collections. And this has been able to persist because, unusually, for a small museum like us, it's remained in the hands of the Powell-Cotton family until very recently. Their direct involvement in the running of the museum only ended in 2016. But we are now operating as a fully independent charitable trust and accredited museum. So we are finally in a position, and frankly have a responsibility, to look at ourselves a bit more critically. And this is where the Reimagining program in the Colonial Critters project is in. So to help you kind of understand exactly how this memorialization of the Powell-Cotton family has manifested in the museum, and you know what the starting place that we are at with this work looks like, I'm going to start with a few visuals. So for many years, this huge portrait of Percy hung in a display case directly opposite the entrance. So it's the first thing you saw when you came into the museum. And for the better part of the last decade, this banner hung on the adjacent wall. The banner gave visitors their introduction to Percy, and I will torture you all now by reading an extract. A compassionate man, Percy didn't just study people as he did animals, but formed friendships. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Percy never assumed he was superior to people he met on his expeditions. He was always careful to be courteous and fair. Those who assisted his expeditions were always paid well and cared for. The objects he collected were bought or exchanged for other goods. Now, hopefully you can already see that the very colonial visuals and the language used in this space, which we call the welcome space, are somewhat problematic, to say the least. The text relies heavily on exceptionalism. The idea that other Europeans in colonized regions of Africa may have been villains, but Percy was good and nice and kind. But Powell-Cotton's own writings, both his personal diaries and his published works, undermine this image. He was, in fact, very typical of Western hunter-collectors of his time. For example, we know now that he regularly used racist and white supremacist language in his writings, that the people working for him on safari faced harsh punishments for even minor mistakes, and that at least some of the collections were obtained through coercion, theft, and very occasionally through violence. But none of this is really reflected in the museum's displays, and this banner, which was only removed at the start of 2022, sets the celebratory tone that still continues as the visitor travels through the museum's 8 galleries. And the major narrative trope that's kind of used in the natural history displays in particular is that of Percy the scientist and conservationist. And like the kind of big friendly colonial trope on that banner, this is also really based on exceptionalism, and it's intended to distance Powell-Cotton from trophy hunting, which had largely fallen out of public favour, even by the time of his death in 1940. Trophy hunting is acknowledged in the museum, but it's played down. The story ends up being that Percy started just hunting for sport, but he learned better and became a conscientious and meticulous scientific collector who disapproved of trophy hunting. This may be a much more palatable story for modern audiences, but it's also undermined by plenty of evidence, not just in our archive, but in our galleries themselves, particularly in our oldest gallery, which this picture is from, where many of the remnants of interpretation from Powell-Cotton's kind of era of running the museum himself sits. And in this gallery, travelogue style descriptions of Powell-Cotton's travels and a boy's own worthy account of his brush with death with a lion sit amongst the various collections of mounted animal heads, skulls, elephant tusks, and objects from across Africa. So what do we do with all of this? So one of the things that I really wanted to do with the Colonial British Project was to get lots of people involved in the reinterpretation process. I read some really cool case studies of other museums doing amazing community-led curation projects and got really excited by the idea. But it became obvious really quickly that that wasn't going to be possible for this project at that time for a few main reasons, one of which is capacity. It was supposed to be a short 2.5-year project with a really small team. The timing is a big one. Running any project during a pandemic is not ideal, and it really impacted on the engagement program. The location actually of the museum is a really big one for us. So the Powell-Cotton Museum sits in a really rural location with poor public transport links in an area that has some of the highest levels of deprivation in England. So even once lockdown ended, it was always going to be a struggle getting people to come to the museum specifically to be involved in this project. And the last kind of challenge of this that I'll mention is one of institutional history and reputation. So, one of the aims of this project was to try and engage communities that have historically been underrepresented in the museum. The museum's audiences have traditionally been very white, primarily schools, families, older people. We did discuss the project with some local Black organisers in 2020, but they told us basically that they didn't feel at all comfortable in the museum spaces and they didn't want to get involved, which is entirely reasonable. There has been some progress in building relationships and representation since we've had these conversations through other projects in the museum, particularly Kathleen Lawther's award-winning Museum Makers project and a brilliant project that is ongoing, which is being run by local freelancer Lucy Enimati, which is called Decolonization and Practice. So, you know, that we are working on these issues, but we do know that building trust is going to take some time. So for all these reasons and more, the Colonial Process Engagement Programme had to be significantly scaled back, and it ended up being kind of a series of one-off events or small mini projects, each of which worked with a different kind of local community group or organisation. We had to sacrifice a lot of the depth of engagement I've been hoping to achieve through this, but it did give us a lot of flexibility to be able to work around, you know, the unpredictability of a pandemic, and we did still get some really positive outcomes. One of which is a temporary exhibition of artworks by students in the Art and Design programme at Dover Technical College, who each created an artwork inspired by one object or animal in the collections. We gave them some information about the history of the objects and how they were collected, and they really ran with it. You know, we gave them a broad brief. They were able to create pretty much whatever they wanted. And some of them really, really engaged with the kind of difficult histories of the collections. And it was a lot of fun to do and really encouraging. It really showed that there is an appetite for engaging with these more challenging histories of the Powell-Cotton Museum among younger audiences. So that was really nice. The process of research for the reinterpretation was much less exciting. A lot of time spent digging around in the archives and reading stacks of books to get some context. And the emerging themes from this research that will probably end up being the focus of our new interpretation are around big game hunting and scientific collecting, so kind of putting the process activities into their context, how collections like this can contribute to studying animals, particularly focusing on taxonomy, as Powell-Cotton collected the type specimens of a number of taxa, as well as animal biographies, kind of highlighting the lived experience of some of the animals themselves. And I've been working with Stuart Black at University of Reading on a project to research the biography of our massive taxidermy elephant, combining detailed archive data on the death and afterlife of this animal with information obtained by Stuart from doing analysis from tail hair and a tusk of this animal. Conservation is one of the other big topics that I want to tackle kind of in the new interpretation, because the roots of kind of modern conservation on the African continent in particular lie within colonialism and hunting, and during the period in which our collections were formed. And in many places today, fortress conservation continues to replicate these colonial structures and violence. I'd really like to explore some of these issues. We're still looking at what the best approach is, but this may involve doing interviews with African people from various regions about their relationships with wildlife and how the national parks and reserves and things impact their communities. And the last thing is the stories of some of the many other people who are involved in building the collections and the museum itself. And I'm particularly interested in the experiences of African people who work with Percy Powell-Cotton. So developing these themes and ideas into new interpretation is still really at the early stages. The project has taken a lot longer than expected due to COVID partly and capacity. But yeah, we're getting there. So one last thing I do want to mention, if I have time, minutes. So I showed you this photo earlier of Gallery 2, which is the oldest part of the museum. This gallery houses, as I said, a mixture of animals and objects, and the various displays in this space are actually all being reinterpreted or redisplayed, or both, through 3 different projects at the moment, including mine. So here we have an opportunity to completely redevelop this one gallery, at least, which is a really exciting opportunity. It has meant more needing dialogue between the various projects to make sure that all of the interpretation will sit well together. And this dialogue has also led to much bigger changes being made than I had even thought that we would be possible. Because we had a really limited budget and a small team, I'm the team, on the Colonial Critters project, all of our interpretation, reinterpretation and interventions that we were planning to make were really small. It was pretty much going to be some text panels. And we hadn't planned to make any changes to the displays themselves or to the fabric of the building. But through discussions with our project partners on some of the other projects, it became clear that we had to address the animal skulls that cover the really walls of this gallery. There are 99 animal skulls on the walls of this gallery. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting anyone here, but our project partners basically told us that they find these animal remains being displayed as they are in such close proximity to the displays of African cultural items are completely inappropriate and disrespectful, particularly in the case of our Ethiopian displays, where the animal skulls are displayed directly above sacred artworks. And, you know, given the long history of Black people being dehumanized, the whole space made me feel very young. So I discussed this with our head of collections and director, and they agreed the best course of action would be to remove all of the skulls from this space and also the ivory archway in the middle. This is a lot of extra work I haven't scheduled or budgeted for, but it is the right thing to do. Not addressing this would have been a massive compromise to both of the kind of redisplay projects that are, or three of the redisplay projects that are working in this area. And it would have been a massive compromise on our commitment to Reimagining the museum. And, you know, this really, I think, highlights the importance of talking to your colleagues and to project partners working on different projects as well, and not just, you know, focusing on one thing. And it really highlights the importance of having a diversity of voices and experiences and opinions in museums. I'd love to be able to show you some progress photos of us taking skulls down, but I can't. As of January this year, all of our redisplay projects have to be put on hold while we carry out an emergency project to deal with a significant mold problem we discovered in some of our storage areas. So that is going to be this year. We're hoping that we'll have the capacity to get back to doing much more exciting things like this next year. So yeah, hopefully next time I'll be able to actually give you a bit more of an update with some progress. Sorry, that's such a whistle-stop tour of our projects, but any questions?
Any questions for Rachel?
As a really lovely talk and a great project. I just wondered, are the Powell-Cottons involved anyway? What did they think about you making down complicated person?
So just to repeat the question, are the Powell-Cottons involved in any way, and something about the complex situation?
Something about how the Powell-Cottons feel, I think. They're not involved. The family's involvement in the museum, as I said, ceased in 2016 with the death of a family member who had been a trustee. The estate that the museum sits on is currently being split between the family and the museum. We are joint inheritors for the estate. There's a lot of legal wrangling going on over that. I don't want to say too much because I feel like it would be unwise, but they aren't basically. There are still some descendants who live locally. They think that what we're doing is attempting to undo Percy's legacy, to demonize the family. That is not at all what we're doing. Obviously, what we want to do is broaden the stories that the museum can tell, make it more inclusive, more relevant space to our audiences. You know, people are complicated. That's what we're trying to bring out of this. We're not trying to demonize him at all, but yes, there are some some factions of the local community who are not at all doing.
Thank you. Sorry, please go ahead.
Do you have a plan for the things that you said?
So for the online folks, the question was, do we have a plan for things being taken off display? Yes, they are basically going up into storage. And yeah, I've spent a lot of time running around in our stores in the basement, which I know is also not an ideal space, trying to create storage space for all of those skulls. So hopefully that's what it will be. And hopefully that will also kind of make some of these collections more available to researchers. I occasionally get requests from people saying, oh, I want to look at these water buffalo skulls. And I'm like, 20 foot up on the wall, I'm sorry, I can't get it down. So, you know, hopefully this will also be an opportunity to look at these collections that, you know, haven't been taken down in years, do a condition check on them, make them more available for researchers to use. So I see it as a really important.
I think Lauren and
Lots of questions. See you later.
No, it's a recipe in by reading.
So I think Lauren had a question.
Bearing in mind the museum is now independent and family changes is changing
Again, for the folks who are online, the question was about whether we were considering keeping the name of the museum, given everything. I think it has been discussed internally, but I don't know what the current thinking is on that. I think it's been discussed by our trustees, but I think for the minute, it's probably, you know, the reality is that this collection is that of the Powell-Cotton family. They are founders without whom it wouldn't exist. So at the moment, I don't think there are any plans to change the name. I don't know. I haven't been involved in this.
Any one last question? Two last questions.
That's at least 4 hands.
How do you communicate with the public? Have you actually avoided using the word decolonization? It's something that we tend to not actually talk about directly, more generally.
Yeah, so we generally, so when we started doing some of this work, and we put out some statements on social media about decolonizing things, and there was some significant trolling of our social media by people who thought that we were going to be ripping the museum apart and, you know, completely changing everything. We were ironically accused of whitewashing the museum in doing this work by some people, and I think part of the problem was that people didn't really understand what we meant when we said we would decolonizing the museum. And since then, we have tried very much in our comments to avoid using that word really, and to be much more specific and kind of detailed in explaining what exactly we are doing. And that really helps, because once people understand what you're doing and why, it makes a lot more sense. They can go, oh yeah, I see the problem here. I totally get that. And you know, while I say we didn't have quite a lot of trolling, we did also get a number of messages that were really supportive from people who were saying, I've never wanted to go to the museum before, I didn't feel like it was for me, or I've been there before, it was really uncomfortable, but now I might consider going. So yeah, we have had a mixture of responses, but yeah, it's been much better, I think, to try and kind of talk much more specifically, much more honestly about what it is that we are doing, because decolonizing is a term that means so many different things.
I'm conscious everybody's stomach is probably rumbling by now.
Sorry.
One last question that you, Lisa, right in front of please, Claire. Sorry, thank you. And then while Claire's walking down, just a quick reminder, when we do go for lunch in a minute, if you could take your cups and saucers through, that would be a fantastic help. And Glenn, are we allowed to leave things in here at our own risk? At your own risk, you're allowed to leave your coats and bags and all your valuables in this room. Next question, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting topic to hear about. I was wondering what your planning is to do with the narrative that has been there for the past 100 years. So you're trying to give a new interpretation to it. Are you also documenting the past narrative and the different specific cases and the way this collection has been spent?
That's tricky. We have in some way, yeah, kind of. We are internally documenting the changes that we're making and the narratives that existed. We're making sure that all the displays are changed, but we are fully taking photos, documenting all that's there. In terms of kind of how we communicate the changes in our thinking and the new narratives to the public, and I really wanted to show everyone an example of one case that I have been working on. So, in fact, in this photo, you can see there's a safari suit on a mannequin with a rifle and stuff with it. So that's just the case that talks about Percy's kind of brushed with death with a lion that attacked him. He was rescued by 3 men who were working on his safari. But the display camera with it has a photo of these 3 gentlemen, but it doesn't name them. We know their names, we know what roles they played on the safari. We do have information about them. In fact, the rifle and the stick and the whip you can see in the case there were items that these people used in rescuing Percy. But that obviously wasn't the only use for these things. So the story of this case has kind of evolved. So while this original text panel was kept up, that tells the kind of boy's own version of the story, in our tours, we've started telling a version of it that is much more focused on the actions of Katakero, Kazamadi, and Murjana who rescued Percy. And as this has kind of evolved, the new interpretation that goes with this case actually will focus much more on using these 3 people as examples of what the experience of safari was like for Africans who were working for Europeans. So we will be basically, it will no longer be the lion story, which I'm very pleased about. The safari suit will be coming off display. I will keep the jacket in the case, I think, because, you know, the fire line does at least demonstrate how dangerous safaris were, and that these people rushed in to rescue him from a lion who was incredibly brave. You know, I know they were being paid to look after him, but I'm not going up against a lion for anyone. Thank you very much. So, yeah, so there has been kind of an evolution in how we're thinking about it, and we are trying to kind of get that in while we're making the changes. That case has now actually been completely decanted and removed from the gallery, so it's not on display anymore, so we can't tell that story. But yeah, we're trying to find ways to kind of do that as we're working through this and kind of show our working and our thinking and explain how the stories are connected to people.
Thank you, Rachel.
Sorry.
I think great opportunity to continue these really amazing discussions over lunch. First